I can see you clearly. Can you nod if you're hearing me? Yay. Okay. All right. And so my apologies. I had an unstable internet connection, and it cut me off right as I was beginning to eulogize Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I think I tried to do one too many things at the same time for my computer's liking. I tried to fix the PowerPoint so that I had the initials in the right direction at the same time that I was trying to speak with you. And I think I overtaxed my computer. Let me see if I can now get that PowerPoint back up. And here we go. No, is that it? Let me see. Yes, that's it. Okay. So I was starting to say that when we think about the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we have to think not only about the fact that we've lost a major voice in the American legal canon, we've also got to think about the political implications. And those implications start as implications for the judiciary, but I think also are implications for the present presidential and national elections. So just a few minutes, and I will be honest with you, I heard about her death last night. I'm not really prepared to give a full summary view of her legal impact. But I think that the first thing to notice is that she was the first feminist appointed to the Supreme Court. Of course, she wasn't the first woman. Sandra Day O'Connor preceded her on the court by about a decade. But Bader Ginsburg really was a feminist and had made her career after suffering discrimination. You may know that she graduated top of her class, close to the top of her class from Stanford Law School, and then was offered only a legal secretary's position, not a law position. And so she had been chief counsel on women's issues for the ACLU, had argued a number of extremely influential cases in front of the Supreme Court. Her record in front of the Supreme Court was 5 out of 6, which is very good for a constitutional lawyer, and arguing essentially against gender stereotypes in the law, and eventually trying to make the case, which she did ultimately make successfully as a justice, that the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, when it enshrines equal protection under the law, includes a protection against gender-based discrimination and stereotypes. And so she joined the court, not just as a woman, the second woman on the court, but as somebody who had made a career out of arguing women's rights, as a self-proclaimed feminist. And so I think one of the things we have to note about her is her feminism, and that in a sense it was unprecedented and trailblazing for a woman to enter the court as someone who was seen as an advocate for women's rights. She spent most of her time on the court in a decided minority. And I hadn't realized this until I read one of the obituaries. She was the first appointment to the Supreme Court by a Democrat since LBJ had appointed Thurgood Marshall. So there had been this long period in which there had only been Republican appointees, and the Republican appointees continued to be a majority on the court throughout her nearly 30 years on the court. She was appointed to the court in 1993, and of course continued on the court until 2020. And born in 1933. I know you're not quite able to see everything because my face is covering it up, but there are her years, 1933 to 2020. And so she not only became a significant influence on the court, primarily in dissent, because she was usually a member of the liberal wing of the court, and the liberal wing of the court was almost always in the minority. And so it was only on the occasions where the four liberal justices could get a fifth justice, whether that was Justice O'Connor or Justice White or more recently Justice Roberts, to join them, right? But for the most part, Ginsburg's legacy, I think the most important case she decided was the VMI, or Virginia Military Institute case, which created an exacting standard for gender to be taken into account by any institution receiving public support, and in particular suggested that gender-based discrimination needed to pass a higher threshold of scrutiny, not quite the same level as racial discrimination, but a high level of scrutiny in order to be legally allowed. What is also, I think, fascinating about Ginsburg is the fact that she became a liberal feminist icon to people who were so much younger than her, people in their teens and their 20s in the last decade. Of course, she became the subject of a graphic novel, or a graphic book, I guess I should say, essentially a comic book, and the subject of 6 different movies, a rap song, etc. And I think it does speak to the hunger in our culture for examples of powerful, committed, authentic women. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg certainly was a very public woman who seemed to meet those demands. And so with this good old tribute to her and her judicial influence, I want to pivot to the fact that this loss has implications beyond implications to the absence of Ginsburg on the court. And of course, one of those implications concerns the presidential and national elections. And here it has been already made absolutely clear by Mitch McConnell, by many others on the Senate, and by Donald Trump himself, that they will move rapidly to try to fill Ginsburg's seat. And of course, this is in direct contradiction to the precedent set in 2016 when Anthony Scalia died, and his the effort by Barack Obama to replace him was blocked by McConnell and the Senate Republicans in order to allow the next president to appoint to the court. To be honest with you, I think it's unlikely that McConnell will succeed in being able to get a majority, let alone a filibuster-proof majority, to support the confirmation of a new justice in the roughly 2 months we have until the coming election, not even 45 days, right? And that the support for doing this in the lame duck session, I'm not sure about, but I suspect again that it will be very difficult for McConnell to actually get a new justice confirmed. But don't put it past him, right? McConnell has been very good at using the Senate rules and procedures, especially with federal judicial appointments. And so it's entirely possible that this will happen. Why is it the case that what seems to be like rather blatant hypocrisy is being adopted by both the Senate Republicans and Donald Trump? And I'll just be clear. I think that Donald Trump sees this as a tremendous opportunity to restart or reorient his political campaign, that he has been spinning his wheels in many respects. His efforts to tar Joe Biden as corrupt or dangerous or inept or diminished have failed, and that the polls seem to show that Donald Trump is unlikely to win re-election. He still has about a 1 in 4 chance of being reelected. But in poll after poll, in battleground states as well as nationally, Donald Trump is trailing. And his campaign really has not been able to gain traction. It's flailing. And not just because it's poorly run, because of the political landscape, because of the fact that the things that are most important to the voters, the coronavirus, the economy, issues to do with racial justice, are all things that are to Trump's disadvantage, right? And so the things that are most on voters' minds are things that Trump cannot address without calling to mind things that for the voters he's got to swing, he has a bad record, right? He's not convincing about. And so he's been trying to change the subject. Changing the subject to a contested fight over a Supreme Court nomination has one clear advantage. It's not talking about the coronavirus. It's not talking about job loss, unemployment, and the failure of the federal government to pass any kind of stimulus legislation or legislation that extends unemployment benefits once those expired in July. It's also not talking about racial injustice in our criminal justice system, another issue on which Trump is in a bad position. And so it allows for a change in the narrative in a way that might be beneficial to Donald Trump. Certainly, it allows for him to try something new. And at this point, I think he may be sufficiently desperate that anything new is a good thing to do. And so that's one reason why you're likely to see a concerted effort to, first of all, make the nomination. Second of all, have a very quick confirmation hearing, and then third, try to get a vote on the floor of the Senate. Whether that'll occur before the elections or, in a sense, straddle the elections or wait until after the elections, we'll have to see. My guess is that Trump will nominate somebody before the elections. And this has the additional advantage to him that it may mobilize his base further, especially the evangelical Christian portion of his base, who seems to have made the Faustian bargain that they will put up with a president who does not in any way embody their values, so long as his Supreme Court appointments are of the kind that they prefer, pro-life conservative, generally in favor of scaling back or limiting the role of the federal government to regulate modern economic life and to limit the civil rights revolution that occurred in this country in the 1950s and 1960s and has been a lasting judicial legacy ever since. So two reasons to do the Supreme Court nomination and the confirmation hearings in the near future. There is a second edge to this sword, however, and that is that already there are good indications that if the election were held today, the Republicans would likely see a significant erosion of their Senate majority of 3, or maybe even lose it altogether. In Arizona, in Maine, in North Carolina, the Republicans appear to be trailing, and there are other Senate campaigns where things may go the Democrats' way as well. And it does appear that having a senatorial, having to put a Republican senator on the record who represents a moderate state, voting for presumably a very conservative justice, one who likely will vote to roll back Roe v. Wade, among other things, is likely to alienate the voters that a Republican candidate for the Senate, say Susan Collins in Maine, needs in order to win re-election. And so there is a countervailing consideration. I don't think that it will prevail, but I do think it's worthwhile noting that although there are very good reasons for Trump to want to change the topic and to concentrate on a judicial nomination right now, there are real dangers in that tact for the Republican Party, including for Donald Trump. And I'm going to put it in very direct terms. The death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the opening of the court, reminds people that the presidential election has deep significance for the future of our society. Now, that may seem strange, right, to say that. It's so blatantly obvious. Why would we need reminding of that? But I would say to you that the people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016, I think many of them thought, first of all, that Trump might not win. And second of all, that it really didn't matter who occupied that office. And it might actually be not a bad thing to disrupt the operation of the federal government by putting somebody in there with little or no experience and not much reverence for the office, not much likelihood to continue tradition. That, given how dysfunctional and non-responsive the federal government could have become, why not try to shake the cage, rattle the cage? And having said that, I would say to you that the coronavirus, its economic consequences, the protests roiling the streets of so many cities and towns in the United States have all already served to remind us this is a position with tremendous power, and the qualifications, quality, disposition of the person who occupies this office matters greatly to how our lives run. And so the idea of putting a reality TV star in the office may have had some appeal in 2016. I think that appeal has been significantly eroded in 2020. But if we're now talking about another conservative appointment to the Supreme Court, one that would prevent Justice Roberts from playing something of the moderating role that he has played, one that much more clearly puts Obamacare on the chopping block so that the Affordable Care Act may in fact be judicially invalidated if another conservative justice is appointed to the court. Also puts Roe v. Wade very much in question. Also puts issues to do with the neutrality, religious neutrality of the law, or with the protection of LGBTQ rights. All of that in question. I think that there is a good likelihood not only that this will equally mobilize, or maybe even mobilize to a greater degree, the left, a group who, frankly, Joe Biden does not inspire, and he struggles a little to motivate, but also that it is going to mobilize women suburban voters, the group that Donald Trump has desperately tried to scare by talking about ruining the suburbs, overrunning them with either riots or even worse, public housing and integration orders. This has failed to work. And not only that, the threat of another conservative justice might have exactly the opposite effect. Now, I'll say one more thing, and I do think we have to take seriously the idea that Mitch McConnell may succeed in getting the votes he needs, having the hearing on time, and appointing another conservative justice to the Supreme Court. I'm not going to give you a number. I don't want to play the game of odds. I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it's impossible. And this raises a more general question in my mind. If we look at the number of appointees that Donald Trump has had to the federal judiciary in his first term in office, right, over 200 appointments. If we look at the Supreme Court appointments, if we look at the direction that the federal judiciary is moving in, it seems clear that even if there isn't another conservative appointment to the Supreme Court, but especially if there is, if Donald Trump loses, if the Democrats succeed in regaining control of the Senate, there may be a major judicial impediment to the kinds of legislation that Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, the Democrats will want to pursue. And that this then raises a question about the relationship between the federal judiciary headed by the Supreme Court and the Constitution. You may have heard speculation, I think it's far too early, but that if Trump and McConnell were to ram through a Supreme Court appointment, that the Democrats, upon retaking the Senate, assuming they do, might drop the filibuster rule altogether and try to pack the court. I don't favor that, but I think it does speak to the question of what can be done in the 21st century in order to make the constitutional machinery of the of our 18th century Constitution work for 21st century conditions. The problem we have right now is, especially in the Senate, there's a vastly disproportionate representation of the least populous states. And the result is that states like Montana, Wyoming, Kentucky, West Virginia have a great deal of influence over who populates the Supreme Court, and they have used that influence, and I shouldn't just say the Supreme Court, the federal judiciary as such, they have used that influence to make the federal judiciary much more conservative than the population of the country as a whole. This is really a topic for another lecture, but I just wanted to flag it for you today, that I think one of the things that we're going to face as a country going forward is a question about what's sometimes called popular constitutionalism. How do the people, through the Senate, the Congress, the presidency, but also through their own mobilized efforts to influence the way in which the Constitution is interpreted, push back against a federal judiciary if that judiciary becomes a major impediment to new legislation. We have faced this problem before as a society, most recently and most prominently in the early days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. It seems we are facing it again, roughly 100 years later. I will stop there for a moment. I imagine many of you might have thoughts or reflections on Ginsburg's passing. I see Bob already has his hand up. Go. I'm trying to unmute you, Bob. You may need to hold your space bar down. Go ahead.
Twice you mentioned the filibuster in relation to this. Is in fact the filibuster still operable? And if so, it would seem to me that there's no way to get nomination confirmed.
Yeah, so the filibuster has been removed for federal judicial appointments, right? Including the Supreme Court. So if it comes to a vote, no, it's just 50 plus the vice president, right? But I believe there might be other procedural places where the Democrats could still potentially require a 60-person vote. I'll be honest with you, this news came as a shock to me rather late last night. I've not come up to speed on all the procedural issues, but some of what I read suggests that there may be bottlenecks in the Senate where the Democrats can still use the filibuster rule to require 60 votes. But I do think if it comes down to a confirmation vote, the real question is going to be, are there 50 votes in the Senate? Lisa Murkowski is already on the record as saying that she would not vote for a appointment this late in the election cycle. I believe Susan Collins off the record said something similar. Mitt Romney may also be in that camp. It's also the case that Arizona is having a special election. If I understand it correctly, the outcome of the Arizona election immediately, if it appoints a Democrat, changes the Arizona Senate seat. That doesn't have to wait till January for the new senator to be appointed, right? And so right there, you've got 3, 4 Republican senators. The Democrat Doug Jones sometimes votes with the Republicans on these issues, and so we'll have to see. But I think it's possible that there are places that the Democrats can put the brakes on with the filibuster rule. If not, it's also possible that they won't even be able to get to 50 votes. But having said that, I don't put it past them. And so I don't want to say it's impossible that Donald Trump will have another appointment to the Supreme Court, even if he's a one-term president. I'm going to
Thank you for making that clear.
Yeah, of course, yeah, and so John said in the chat bar, you may have seen this already, the filibuster can't be used for appointments anymore. I think that's exactly right, John. The question is whether there are other places in the process that the Democrats could use the filibuster. Anybody else? Let me just for a moment unmute everyone. So get ready. Background noise will show up. Here we go. Let's see how it does. You guys are quiet as a church today. Thank you. John, go ahead.
A hullabaloo about what McConnell said about why he could do it now. They couldn't, one thing 3 years ago and something else this year reminds me of the phrase, hypocrisy is the compliment that virtue pays to vice.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I don't know if everybody knows what John is referring to. My understanding is that McConnell is saying that because Obama was in his second term when Scalia died, you had to wait, that he no longer had the mandate that he needed. But because Trump is in his first term, yeah, he does have the mandate to appoint. John, you're raising your hand. Go ahead. Was there something else?
Yes, he also added that the last time the previous election had brought the, had basically Trump had picked up, not Trump, the Republicans had picked up votes in the midterm elections. So the trend was going in that direction, and that Trump and that the Republicans had all campaigned on nominating a conservative justice, which they certainly had. So in that sense, it's sort of plausible, but if he didn't have that argument, he'd have some other argument. And he probably wouldn't just say, we got the votes, so see you around. He would have some sort of plausible tale, but not what we need to worry about.
Yeah, so I don't know if you've noticed this, and it, in a sense it's obscure, but I think it's illuminating. and bear with me for a second while I take a long detour. The Heritage Foundation website published an article claiming that Black Lives Matter is funded by the Chinese Communist Party. and the reason they do this is because Black Lives Matter has received funding from an organization that has the same name as another organization that in fact did receive some funding from the Chinese Communist Party. But they're two completely different organizations. Now, I'm no big fan of the Heritage Foundation, but I do have to say, at least I thought that the Heritage Foundation had the integrity not to be the platform on which obviously manufactured disinformation was propagated, right? And lo and behold, even after it was pointed out to them that maybe you confuse these two organizations. One of them is funded by the Chinese, one of them isn't. They have the same name. It's the one not funded by the Chinese that is making contributions to Black Lives Matter. They refused to pull the article down, right? And so it seems to me that in a sense, we now live in a world where vast amounts of false information circulate regularly, and some of it gets amplified very loudly on the mainstream media. And my point is that if you are willing to take advantage of that, what appears to be hypocrisy may not ever come back to bite you, right? There's so much distortion, so much disinformation, so much muddying of the water. And that at this point, not only the Republican Party, but what I thought of as somewhat reputable conservative public policy think tanks like the Heritage Foundation are also willing to go down this path. And so, yes, there's obvious hypocrisy in the idea that we will not consider Obama's nominee 9 months out from an election, but we will consider Trump's nomination a month and a half out, right? And by the way, not only that, 9 months out, it appeared that Clinton would probably win, or that the Democrats would probably win. It appears that Trump will probably lose, right? And so if you're trying in some way to be responsive to the people's will, it seems to point in the opposite direction. But what I really want to emphasize here is, why would the Heritage Foundation publish something so obviously false? Why have so many people, not only on the right wing of the media sphere, but also in the Republican Party, seemingly lost any commitment to the truth or to principled politics? And here I want to say that in a sense, there is something like a principled argument, which is that this country is losing its moral foundations, that the liberals have become complete moral relativists, that we care more about identity, that we are selling out the culture that has sustained this society, which is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, a culture of virtue, and we're replacing it with multicultural nihilism or Marxism or anarchism, right? And that in a sense, if that's your worldview, the idea that you would do anything you could to secure the next nominee to the Supreme Court, to have some kind of firewall or break on this process, maybe makes sense. I'm doing my best to reconstruct an argument that I don't have much sympathy for, obviously, when I try to make sense of how it is that the Republican Party reconciles itself to this obvious hypocrisy, that's the best I can do. All right, John, thanks as always for an interesting comment. Anybody else with a comment on this, or should I push on into other material at this point? Okay, so I'm not going to speak anymore about Ginsburg, and I'm not going to speak anymore about things to do with the election. I'm going to return us to the topic of our lecture series. And as you will remember, I hope last week we began a new lecture series on race and justice in America in the 21st century. And we had started our first topic. You may notice I've shifted from week to topic here because it occurs to me I'm not going to probably be able to do these topics in a week. And so we were looking at our historical overview of race and racism in America. We're then going to look at law and policy and the role that they've played in, on the one hand, counteracting racism, and on the other hand, perpetuating racial inequality in America. We're then going to look at the social sciences and the way in which they help us to understand the way in which race is perpetuated as a major source of social order, hierarchy, and inequality, despite the fact that the vast majority of Americans say that it is impermissible to be racist in the 21st century. We will then complicate things by looking at racial categories beyond black and white, and finally look at issues of ethics and justice and democracy, what we should do about race if we want to be an equal, inclusive, democratic society going forward into the 21st century. So I'm now on my second lecture, but it's a continuation of the first lecture where we're talking about an overview of race and racism in America. And I pointed out to you protests across the country in response, in the first instance, to George Floyd's brutal killing, and the digital document that we have of it, that this is just one of literally thousands of police killings of African Americans. That this occurred in the context of the coronavirus and its racial asymmetries, and at a moment when many of us were perhaps more aware of the fact that we are dependent on African Americans and Latinos for our essential goods, for the essential work that they do, right? And at the same time, the fact that we're all cooped up, that so many of us are unemployed, either temporarily or permanently, also created propitious circumstances for the protests to occur. I then concluded last week's lecture by looking at some of the statistics on criminal justice in the United States and the racial asymmetries. How much more likely African Americans are to be killed by the police than white Americans. The fact that this is highly variable, it depends upon whether or not the police department in question has adopted policies that have been proven to reduce police violence, especially racial violence or racial asymmetries in the police use of lethal force. And I just want to call your attention to the idea that de-escalating, having a use of force continuum, having a duty to intervene such that those other officers that were standing by when Derek Chauvin was choking the life out of George Floyd are not permitted to do that, have to intervene when they believe excessive or unnecessary force is being used. Banning chokeholds and strangleholds, etc. All of this has been proven to bring police-related deaths down substantially, to the point where when Buffalo, New York adopted these policies, it went to having 0 police deaths over a 5-year period. The same period in Orlando, Florida, which has not adopted these policies, has a very similar population and crime rate. They have many more police deaths. Finally, I think underlying these protests is the sense that not only do the police disproportionately profile, use violence against and kill African Americans, but they do so with impunity. There is no accountability. And I think this diagram is quite stunning. If you look into the police-related killings in the United States, it's more than 96 out of 100 where there are no criminal charges whatsoever. And in those few cases where there are criminal charges, almost never, less than 1% of the time, is an officer convicted. Some of this has to do with prosecutorial discretion and the fact that prosecutors are reluctant to charge the police because they depend on the police to build their cases. They need to get convictions to get reelected, prosecutors do, right? And yet if they start prosecuting the police may stop cooperating with them, and then they're going to be in trouble in their office, right? In addition, there is the fact that in general, juries tend to be sympathetic with police officers and tend to believe the testimony they hear from police officers more than the testimony they hear from the community. There's also the so-called blue wall of silence, where police officers will not testify against each other. You put all of these factors together and you don't have an effective mechanism of accountability when there is police violence and a suspicion that that violence is unjustified. I've concentrated so far on the most glaring visible problem here, which is the use of lethal force by the police and its disproportionate targeting of African Americans. But there's a broader problem, what is sometimes called the crisis of mass incarceration. And as you can see, the population of the United States in prison increased by 8-fold from the late 1970s through the last decade. It's actually started to go down a little bit, and there has been some meaningful reform in sentencing guidelines under President Trump, and I believe he and Congress deserve credit for that. Having said that, this is nevertheless stunning, right? The United States has become the country in the world with the highest proportion of its population incarcerated. This is due to 3 strikes and you're out rules. It's due to mandatory sentencing directives imposed on judges. It's due to the war on drugs and a tough on crime culture that goes back before the 1970s. This was already a relatively high rate relative to most other countries. By the way, you add to this the fact of the inhumanity of treatment of prisoners within our prisons, and it compounds the extent to which we have a real crisis in our country around imprisonment in general. But when you look at the percentage relative to the population of different groups in jail, you begin to see that there's a clear racial dimension to the mass incarceration crisis, right? And what you see is that African Americans are about 5 times more likely to be imprisoned than are white Americans relative to their proportion of the population in the United States. This has something to do with prosecutorial discretion again. And I'll very briefly mention, there's a really wonderful study of the Minneapolis prosecutor's office. In 2015, I believe it was, a new prosecutor came in and he made a vow that he would eliminate the racial asymmetry in prosecution in the Minneapolis office. And he directed all of his prosecutors to bring equal number of charges and equal sentencing to whites and blacks. And he actually fired some prosecutors and hired some new prosecutors in order to be able to do this. And then 2 years into his term, he commissioned a study, and he found essentially that there had been very little change in his regime from the previous regime, that there were similar asymmetries. and that the prosecutors didn't think that they were disobeying his policy. They thought, in fact, they were conforming to it. But that nevertheless, and this will be a category that we're going to think about a lot in the coming weeks, their implicit bias, their stereotypes, their sense generated by our culture and our media of what a criminal looks like, how you determine if somebody really is deserving of being prosecuted to the full extent of the law. That there's a racial dimension to that that influences the judgment of even well-meaning liberal African-American prosecutors, right? And so that what Minneapolis eventually did was to adopt monthly data collection and reports so that each prosecutor saw in a spreadsheet, this is how many whites have been charged. This is how many have decided to prosecute. This is how many blacks have been charged, how many Latinos have been charged, how many have decided to prosecute. This is how many have successfully prosecuted. These are the sentences. And so that they could actually monitor in real time using data what they were doing in order to correct their implicit bias. And I just want to have you have that in mind. When we start thinking about the social science, what we're going to see is that intention, good intentions, are not enough. That one can want not to think in terms of race, want to be perfectly equal in one's treatment of whites, blacks, Latinos, but that if racial thinking has gotten implanted in your mind, structures the way you see the world, the way you see threat, the way you judge, good intentions are not enough. Implicit bias wins out. Part of the reason, if you go back, and I now want to pick up the thread for the remaining few minutes, that there's such a higher rate of African Americans in jail than there are of white Americans in jail. It's not only because Black Americans are prosecuted more often, it's also because they do more time. And by the way, I just want to be clear, there are some minor discrepancies in the rates in which members of different races commit crimes. The crime data in the United States is not very well collected, right? It's collected by individual police departments, then the FBI tries to collate it. They get different levels of cooperation from different local police departments, and they're also not certain about how good the data collection is even in those police departments that do cooperate, right? And so we have to be careful in thinking we know exactly what's happening with crime, but it does appear basically that whites and blacks commit crimes at very similar levels in most categories of crime. So the explanation here for these discrepancies isn't that African Americans are committing 5 times as much crimes as whites. That's clearly not what's driving this. Part of what's driving it is prosecutorial discretion and implicit bias. Part of it is that African Americans, depending upon the year, serve between 5% and almost 20% more time for the same crime as do white Americans, right? And so if you're spending 20% more time in jail, that means that there are 20% more people who look like you in jail than there are of people from different racial categories. So part of what explains the disproportionate portion of African Americans in the criminal justice system is the disproportionate sentencing of African Americans in that same system. Finally, as we can see, race has a very pronounced influence on the rate of conviction. If you commit a murder, if you are charged with murder, right? You are 7 times more likely to be convicted if you are white than if you're black. If you are charged with sexual assault, 3.5 times. If you were charged with a drug crime, 12 times. Anyone got a theory as to why it is that African Americans end up convicted so much more often than white Americans do?
Some of it surely is financial.
And how does the financial side of it work?
The whites tend to be able to afford better lawyers, post bond, do all those things that the system allows them to work.
Good. And so whites get much more effective counsel because whites have more wealth and income than blacks do. Do you know how the vast majority of people who are convicted in the United States are convicted? Is it trial by jury? It's not,
No.
right? I'm looking for Matt. I don't know who else among us is a lawyer.
It's plea bargaining.
Pardon?
Plea bargaining. It's plea bargaining.
Yeah, John, thank you. Not even a lawyer, but yes, it's plea bargaining, right? And one of the things we know is that public defenders plea bargain much more often than do private lawyers, right? And I actually have been in a court fighting a parking ticket when a public defense defender was arguing with his client. And so I overheard firsthand what numerous studies suggest is systematic in the American criminal justice system. This court-appointed defense attorney saying to his client saying, I'm innocent, I don't want to take the plea bargain, I don't want to have the record. And the public defender saying to him, you're going to take that plea bargain or I'm not going to represent you. And then you're going to go to jail for even longer. I can't afford any more time on your case, right? And so please note that this is systemic in the sense that we have a system of public defenders that does not allow sufficient time per case for the public defender to defend each person in front of a jury if they believe they are innocent. And in a sense, even allowing somebody who they believe is innocent to plead guilty on a reduced sentence may be, in their judgment, the best way to serve the interests of their client pool as a whole, because perhaps it allows them to dedicate more time to someone who's in even more serious jeopardy, right? And so yes, part of the issue here, when we go back to that diagram of why it is that people are convicted more often, is simply that whites have on average 10 to 14 times more wealth than African Americans. We can afford private representation. When we get good legal representation, much more likely to be exonerated or not convicted, right? And so some of this has to do with another dimension of underlying inequality between blacks and whites, and that is financial or social inequality. In addition to that, of course, there is the implicit bias, sometimes explicit bias, of both prosecutors and defense lawyers, right? And there's some pretty good indication that public defenders spend more time and more energy representing their white clients than they do their black clients or their Latino clients. And there's also the implicit bias of juries. Juries are often more likely to convict an African American than they are to convict a white American. There's a journalist, a very well regarded journalist who writes on issues to do with criminal justice and the drug trade, who herself was a drug mule. And she was caught with 2 kilos of cocaine coming over the border from Mexico. She was a student, I believe, at Williams College at the time, and she pled guilty She was addicted to heroin at the time. She cleaned up between the time that she was apprehended and the time she actually came in front of the judge. The judge gave her a suspended sentence. Said, yeah, you tried to move a couple kilos of cocaine over the border, but you seem like a nice person. You're in college. You've gotten off of drugs. Let's give you a second chance, right? And as it turns out, she's never committed another criminal deed in her life, as far as we know, become a well-regarded reporter. My point is that never happens, or I can't imagine that happening to an African American in that same scenario. Bob, go ahead.
So that was going to be my question. Is there any data on bias on the bench?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's reflected in that length of time served, right? So why are African Americans serving 20% more time than white Americans? Usually the sentence has a discretionary dimension to it, and the sentence is determined by the judge, right? And so at that level, there's pretty clear evidence. The part of the problem here is, and again, the lawyers among you know this better than I do, that there are many aspects of a trial that don't show up in either the decision or the sentence, right? So how does the judge rule on various motions in terms of admissibility of evidence during the trial, right? And there are scholars who strongly suspect that there are racial asymmetries in those procedural issues in the courts. But the evidence is incredibly hard to gather. And certainly in a country as large that prosecutes as many people as the United States does, we've not been able to get that kind of evidence yet. So it remains more anecdotal at this point than systematic, the evidence of systematic judicial bias. There's a whole different issue here, which I just can't help myself but mentioning. Reuters did a report on judicial misconduct a couple months ago. And one of the things that I was just stunned to find is that there's a widespread judicial misconduct in the United States, and most judges who do things like illegally impose sentences on African Americans, and it does tend to have a racial dimension to it, for things like failing to pay parking tickets. So there's one case of a woman, I believe in South Carolina, who spent 400 days in jail for failing to pay moving violation tickets, right? And they were ticky-tack violations, things to do with lacking registration, not like she was going 100 miles an hour through a pedestrian area. The judges who engage in misconduct are almost exclusively punished by a judicial panel. And it's almost always perfunctory punishment, right? They get a slap on the wrist, maybe 60 days without pay, and then they're right back on the judiciary, right? And so if this is meant to be a disincentive for judicial misconduct, it's not working. So all that to say, I've got reasons to suspect part of the issue is the way in which judges adjudicate during trials, but we don't have the kind of evidence to be as certain about that as we do of some of the other stuff. Thanks, Bob. Anybody else? Let me unmute everyone. I can see Flossie has her hand up. I'm going to unmute Flossie next. You're going to have to hold down your bar, Flossie, remember? Flossie, I'm not hearing you.
There.
Good. Got it. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There's a little park in San Francisco. It's called the Union Square Park. It may have been changed. It's some time since I've been out in the world, but I once witnessed an incident where a young woman was accosting a white man who had left a bench where the two of them had been seated. She was begging him in tears to return her wallet. She was crying out in public that she'd been writing letters and that she was on her way to fly to Australia. And he had picked up her pocketbook, which had the ticket to Australia, her wallet, and some other identification. She was in tears. The man was white, not especially, rather sloppily dressed. There was a crowd gathering around her. Nobody laid a hand on this guy. He was white. If he had been black, there would have been a policeman called, and some of the residents would have restrained him and begged him to open his vest. He walked away. She was left with nothing, her money gone, her tickets gone, and he was the only one who had been sitting beside her while she was writing the letter.
Yeah, and so Flossie, you nor I know what actually happened in that case, right? She might have been confused or mistaken. He might have been innocent. But having said that, the presumption that because you're white, especially if you're white and clean cut and dressed in a certain way, right? That you are a law-abiding citizen doesn't quite capture it, right? There's a term that the sociologist Mead introduced. I'm just, let me see if I've got the book here. Anyway, let me not digress with the citation. The generalized other, that in our society, you encounter anonymous people all the time. When you encounter them, do you assume that person is like me? Which is to say, trustworthy, law-abiding, contributing to the society, worthy of respect? Or instead, do you assume that they are worthy of suspicious, mistrust, dangerous, right? And that there is a racialized dimension to how we distribute sympathy and recognition in our society. And that this is deeply embedded in our culture, right? It's not just each of us individually making up a decision. It's what we see on the nightly news. It's what we see on the TV. It's what we witness from our parents, not in terms of their explicit prejudice, but in terms of their implicit fear, right? We're very sensitive to that kind of stuff, even if it doesn't cognitively or consciously register on us. And the result is not only that do we maybe not intervene in the situation that you're describing, Flossie, but that more generally, if you are fortunate enough to be white, you don't have the burden of being generally mistrusted or suspect or looked down upon by your society. And you don't have to deal with the burden of constantly wondering whether the person looking at you is seeing you, who you are, or at least regarding you neutrally as a general other, or is in fact suspicious of you, mistrustful of you, hostile to you, on guard around you for no other reason than the amount of pigment you have in your
You
skin.
know, David,
Right? Yeah.
she might have, if she were not so genteelly bred, insist that she was making a citizen's arrest. She could have used that term.
Yeah.
But she was genteel, begging him, telling him how desperate she was, and he was saying, I didn't touch anything.
And so you told us about the race of the man. What was the race of the woman?
Oh, absolutely white.
Okay. Because I mean, if the scenario had been she was black, then there would have been yet another dimension to this, right? Which is it, you know, I think last week I asked you to do the experiment of reversing the races of George Floyd and Derek Chauvin, right? And thinking about what would have happened had that been a black man kneeling on the knees of a white man who was handcuffed, right? And so I was wondering with your example, if maybe she was black and that was part of the reason for her reticence in confronting the man more directly. All right, I think we should call it a day. I've enjoyed being with you as always. The air there is a little better, is that right?
Much better.
Good. Okay, that's what I'm hearing from relatives in the area as well. I'm glad to hear that. Take advantage of it while you can. Take care, everyone. Please keep being safe and smart, and we will continue the conversation next Saturday. Bye-bye.